One of the great coups of private capital was to create the UK's railway system in the 19th century. But now fares are high and disruption is frequent, as reflected in travel chaos over Christmas. Business editor Sarah Gordon has been studying state-owned operator Network Rail and asking this question: why has the permanent way become a permanent embarrassment? Sarah.
I think that's perhaps putting it a bit strongly. I don't think it's a permanent embarrassment, but it's certainly, we love to complain about Network Rail. I mean, I think they're facing a huge challenge. I mean, as they themselves say, they build the equivalent of an Olympic stadium every month whilst hosting matches in it. And they, maintaining and investing in the infrastructure of the UK is a huge task. However, they themselves acknowledge, if not on the record, that they could be doing a better job, and the regulator acknowledges that they could be doing a better job.
The perception, though, of a lot of rail travellers in the UK, including a lot of FT readers who come in strap-hanging every morning to work in the square mile, is that the railway system in the UK doesn't work half as well as alternatives on the continent, in Germany or France. Are they right?
Yes, sometimes. I mean, on punctuality data, I mean, we don't do as well as some other continental European countries. But the issue is that they are all organised in different ways. In Germany, for example, Deutsche Bahn is both the train operator and the maintainer and investor in the network. In France, it's divided between SNCF and RFF, but in fact, a lot of stuff is subcontracted back to SNCF. So you have a much more unified system. I mean, it's also, worth saying that Deutsche Bahn spends a lot more on capital investment than we, the taxpayer, do in this country.
Would a structural change, bringing together the rolling stock and the rails in the UK, which was the way things used to be done before privatisation, be a possible means of improving the service?
Well, it's one of these things that constantly gets mooted as a possible solution to an intractable problem. It is possible that by bringing the operators and the network closer together, you would get better communication. They would not be seen as adversarial, which quite often in the last decade has been the case. The problem is that, for example, if you moved them into little regional operations where the train operators and the network were run as one, you lose the economies of scale of investing in the whole network around the UK. I mean, that's not to say that it doesn't have certain advantages. I mean, one of the issues that I found incredibly frustrating about looking into this is that people do have alternatives. They've been discussing alternatives for decades. Nobody seems to get it right. And indeed, Network Rail itself, as have been evinced by the difficulties I've had reporting them, are extremely defensive about what challenges they face.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because it sounds to me as if researching an article about a large publicly run body has been a bit like going undercover to write about something far more secretive. I think you had one meeting with Network Rail at Euston Station at 7:30 in the morning. Does that tell us something about how defensive they feel and also about the level of disclosure?
I found it extremely peculiar how defensive that they were. I mean, compared to a publicly listed company in which I'm not a shareholder, I'm just a journalist, I've had greater willingness to talk to me, greater willingness to go on the record than I've had from Network Rail, where we, the taxpayer, provide 2/3 of the revenue and the government pays for all the investment. I think they feel very much under the spotlight. I think they feel very over-scrutinised. They feel they're trying to do a good job and that they're not helped by any observation.
And is regulation too tight? Is there too much of it?
Well,
Should they be liberated?
I think the irony is that in fact there's too much. There's too much paper, there are too many targets, there's too cumbersome a bureaucracy and a process. Far too much money spent on the whole process of regulating and trying to hold Network Rail to tiny targets like how many trees should be removed from one particular railway track each year between now and 2019. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, in some ways you could argue that Network Rail is actually ironically over-regulated, that it's like a disempowered teenager with over-controlling parents.
And what we could also say is that the relationship between the railway system and business and the state is always going to be a difficult and acrimonious one. As you point out in your article, in 1830, George Stephenson's rocket ran over the president of the Board of Trade on its maiden voyage. Thank you, Sarah.